The scent of white lilies mixed with the damp earth of the cemetery, creating a suffocatingly thick atmosphere beneath a massive black umbrella. Sarah stood frozen, staring at the raw pine coffin resting on the bier. Unvarnished, no metal fixtures, no embalming. According to Evelyn, her father's young wife, this was a green burial, hastily arranged less than 24 hours after Arthur had supposedly passed away from a stroke. It was his dying wish, Evelyn had said the night before, her voice trembling behind a black lace-trimmed handkerchief. Arthur wanted to return to the earth in the most natural way possible, and as quickly as possible. Sarah didn't believe her father had ever uttered those words, but the sudden crushing grief had drained her of the energy to argue. Now, she simply stood there, watching the misting rain speckle her coat, listening to the monotonous voice of the priest delivering the eulogy. On the other side of the coffin stood Evelyn, her posture ramrod straight. The black veil couldn't hide her flawless facade, the very picture of a grieving widow. But as Sarah's gaze drifted over, she caught a strange detail. Evelyn's silk-gloved hand was gripping her purse strap white knuckle tight, and the toe of her stiletto was tapping a rhythmic, impatient beat against the wet grass. That wasn't the gesture of a woman falling apart. That was sheer impatience. Evelyn kept shooting covert glances at the Cartier watch on her wrist. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing bark tore through the solemn silence. Sarah whipped around, at the edge of the tented area. Duke, her father's 90-pound golden retriever mix, was frantically straining against the leather leash held by the estate manager. Marcus, unlike other dogs who had lost their masters and let out mournful, pathetic whines, Duke wasn't crying. He let out a rhythmic, guttural bark, his teeth bared, the fur along his spine standing straight up like a spear. "Hold him back, Marcus!" Evelyn hissed, her voice abruptly pitching up, shattering her perfect facade. "Get him to the car, now!" But it was too late. With a violent jerk, Duke twisted and slipped his collar. The leather leash dropped into the mud. The massive dog bolted through the rows of iron folding chairs, knocking over a large floral arrangement of lilies. He didn't run to Sarah or Evelyn. He launched himself like a bullet straight at the pine coffin. Duke's front paws slammed onto the casket. He let out a choked howl deep in his throat. And then he began to dig. The sound of his sharp claws tearing into the unvarnished pine was agonizing. Like nails on a chalkboard, wood splinters flew. Duke frantically clawed at the lid. He bit into the wooden rim, trying to use the sheer power of his jaws to pry it open. "Good Lord, catch that crazy dog!" Evelyn screamed in panic, backing away. "He's ruining the ceremony. Bury him! Hurry!" she yelled at the stunned gravediggers. Marcus and two other men rushed forward, grabbing Duke around his waist to haul him off, but the dog suddenly unleashed a ferocious snarl, a wild, absolutely menacing sound that made all three men instinctively recoil. Duke turned back and latched onto the coffin, resuming his frantic digging. The paw pads on his feet had torn open. Streaks of bright red blood began to stain the pale pine. "Duke, stop!" Sarah lunged forward, reaching to wrap her arms around the dog's neck, but the moment her hand touched his soaking wet fur, Duke turned his head to look at her. He froze. That wasn't the wild gaze of a deranged animal. Duke's amber eyes were wide, brimming with tears, yet flashing with an overwhelming, desperate urgency. He let out a tiny whimper, forcefully nudged his snout toward the microscopic gap between the lid and the base of the coffin, and stared straight into Sarah's eyes, as if screaming a message in silence. He's not mourning. He's trying to save him. A jolt of ice-cold electricity shot down Sarah's spine, slowly. She pressed her palm flat against the cold pine. She held her breath, amidst the shocked whispers of the guests and the pattering rain. Right beneath Sarah's palm, there seemed to be a vibration, incredibly faint, incredibly weak, but it was not the stillness of death. "Nail it shut!" Evelyn's voice had grown shrill and unhinged. She lunged forward, snatching a hammer from a gravedigger. "Do it now!" "Back off!" Sarah screamed with all her might, shoving Evelyn's hand away from the casket. "Marcus, hand me that crowbar. Open the lid." "You're insane, Sarah! This is a desecration of your father's body!" Evelyn shrieked, her eyes bulging with fury and an unmistakable flash of terror, ignoring the protests. With Marcus's help, Sarah wedged the crowbar into the rim and threw her weight onto it. The wooden pegs snapped, the heavy lid was shoved aside. The entire cemetery plunged into absolute dead silence. Even Duke stopped barking. He just stood there panting, his wet nose buried against the inner lining of the casket. Arthur lay there, his skin ashen, his eyes tightly shut. He still looked like a cold corpse. Pitying sighs began to ripple through the crowd behind Sarah. She felt her heart sink, tears welling up at her own crazy impulsiveness. But just as Sarah was about to collapse, Duke gently licked Arthur's freezing hand. A moment of stillness passed. Then, the thin silk fabric draped over Arthur's chest suddenly fluttered, just a fraction. A thin wisp of breath escaped the man's dry lips, forming a tiny cloud of vapor in the cold cemetery air. It was accompanied by a sound Sarah would never forget for the rest of her life. A ragged, shallow gasp for air, weak but desperately clinging to life. Sarah looked up, locking eyes with Evelyn, whose face was now completely drained of blood, standing 3 steps away. "Call 911, Sarah roared, her voice trembling but crystal clear. "My father is alive." The sterile, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor echoed in the intensive care unit, replacing the deathly silence of the cemetery. The sharp smell of rubbing alcohol and antiseptic hung heavy in the frigid air, entirely overpowering the suffocating scent of lilies. Arthur lay on the hospital bed, a tangle of plastic tubes and EKG wires taped to his frail chest. He was breathing, albeit with the help of a mechanical ventilator. "I haven't seen a case like this in 20 years of practice," Dr. Aris frowned, staring intently at the medical chart on his tablet. His blood pressure and heart rate flatlined to the baseline of a deceased person, yet his brain suffered no hypoxic damage. It's as if his entire nervous system was temporarily frozen. A standard tox screen came back totally negative. Sarah stood in the corner of the room with her arms crossed, her dark-circled eyes glued to her father, right beneath the hospital bed. Duke lay curled up, thanks to the emotional support animal card Arthur always kept in his wallet. The hospital had made a rare exception to let the massive dog stay since entering the room. Duke had been perfectly behaved. His golden tail rested on the floor, his broad snout gently resting on the back of Arthur's hand where the IV was taped, occasionally giving it a soothing lick. The quiet was shattered when the heavy glass door of the ICU swung open. Evelyn walked in. She had swapped her morning dress for a beige silk blouse and elegant slacks. Her minimal makeup made her look pale and exhausted, the absolute picture of a wife devastated by shock. But Duke didn't care about her makeup. The second the heel of Evelyn's shoe clicked against the tile floor, Duke's head snapped up, his ears pinned flat against his head. The fur along his spine instantly shot up like steel wire bristles. Grrr. A low, guttural growl rumbled from deep within the animal's chest, unlike the frantic chaos at the cemetery. This time, Duke projected a cold, lethal menace. He slowly stepped out from under the bed, planting himself directly between Evelyn and Arthur, baring his white canines. "My God, Doctor, please get that monster out of here." Evelyn froze, backing up flat against the glass door, her voice pitching high with genuine fear. Sarah narrowed her eyes. She noticed that when Dr. Aris and the 2 nurses had walked around checking the IV lines earlier, Duke had actually backed away to give them space and even wagged his tail. Only Evelyn triggered his attack instinct. Dogs possess an apex sense of smell and a 6th sense for sniffing out malice. They don't know how to lie. "Duke, sit." Sarah stepped forward, slipping her fingers under the dog's collar. The rigid tension and vibrating growl beneath her palm made her shiver. It took a long moment, accompanied by Sarah's soothing whispers, before Duke finally sat down, but his amber eyes didn't leave Evelyn for a single millimeter. "He's still just rattled from the incident this morning," Sarah said, her voice icy, her gaze piercing right through her stepmother. Evelyn took a deep breath, smoothed the crease of her blouse, and tried to regain her aristocratic poise. She turned to Dr. Aris, forcing a dry tear to the corner of her eye. "Doctor, how is my husband? When will this nightmare end?" "We are doing everything we can, ma'am. Since standard tests haven't revealed the cause of the coma, I'd like to recommend sending his blood and spinal fluid to the state's central lab for a comprehensive toxicology screening and biopsy. It could be heavy metal poisoning or perhaps a rare synthetic neurotoxin. Instantly, the hand clutching Evelyn's Hermes bag tightened until her knuckles turned stark white. She missed half a heartbeat, though subtle. Sarah caught it. A spinal tap? Comprehensive toxicology? Evelyn's voice suddenly turned razor sharp, losing all its previous tremor. He just suffered a stroke and was nearly buried alive, and now you want to drill into his spine to run experiments? Ma'am, it's the only way to— No! Evelyn cut him off, tilting her chin up, deploying her ultimate weapon. I am Arthur's legal wife. I hold his medical power of attorney. Arthur told me himself he would rather die than live as a vegetable or endure barbaric invasive procedures. His final memories cannot be of pain. Sarah felt the blood boiling in her veins. Evelyn, Dad is lying right there. He's breathing. What the hell are you talking about? I am protecting your father's dignity. Sarah! Evelyn spun around, glaring at her stepdaughter. Dr. Eris, I am giving you 24 hours. If his condition doesn't naturally improve by tomorrow night, I demand you pull the plug, and I forbid any invasive extractions on my husband's body. With that, Evelyn turned on her heel and marched out of the room, not forgetting to shoot the heart monitor a glance that Sarah could now read perfectly. Impatience. The door slammed shut. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Dr. Aris sighed, looking helplessly at Sarah. She has the legal right. Sarah, unless the police have a criminal investigation warrant. I can't arbitrarily send the blood out for specialized screening, and I can't stop her from pulling the ventilator tomorrow. 24 hours. That was all the time Evelyn needed to finish the death sentence she had started. The rushed green burial, the fury when the coffin was opened, the refusal of blood work. The pieces were locking together into a terrifying puzzle in Sarah's mind. A wet touch brushed against the back of Sarah's hand. She looked down. Duke was nuzzling her hand, letting out a soft whimper. His eyes stared at the door where Evelyn had just exited, then flicked back to Arthur. He knew. This dog had known something was wrong since before his master ever collapsed. You smelled something, didn't you, big guy? Sarah dropped to one knee, whispering into Duke's ear, hugging his thick neck. You know what she did to him? Her suspicion alone wasn't enough to bring in the cops. She needed proof, something at the house, something Evelyn used to stage this fake death. And right now. Evelyn was at the hospital, likely staking out the cafeteria to ensure no doctor ran a test behind her back. Sarah shot to her feet, grabbing her coat. Dr. Eris, please stay in here and lock this door. Don't let anyone in, Sarah said rapidly. Let's go. Duke, we're going home. Duke gave a sharp, definitive bark. The two bolted out of the ICU, kicking off a race against the Grim Reaper. Heavy rain lashed against Sarah's Volvo as it skidded onto the gravel driveway of the estate. The three-story Victorian mansion loomed in the dark, windows pitch black, exuding a chilling, desolate aura. Sarah killed the engine, glancing at the dashboard clock. 10:15 p.m. Evelyn was still holding vigil at the hospital, playing the part of the distraught wife pacing outside the ICU. She had a couple of hours at least. The second the car door opened, Duke shot out, his snout tracking mere inches from the soaking ground. He didn't bound around happily like he usually did when coming home. Instead, his posture was rigid, his tail tucked, his hurried footsteps full of high alert. Sarah slid her key into the lock and pushed open the solid oak front door. The house was oppressively silent. The sickly yellow light from the chandelier cast their long shadows against the wood-paneled walls. Find it, Duke, Sarah whispered, unbuckling his collar completely. Find what she hid? Normally, when Duke came home, he would sprint to the second floor, dive under Arthur's bed, and curl up on a blanket steeped in his master's scent. But tonight, his nose twitched erratically in the air. The massive dog's chest heaved as he pulled in thousands of invisible scent particles floating in the house. Suddenly, Duke gave a short bark, whipped around, and bolted down the hallway toward the glass door at the back of the house. He bypassed the bedroom. He bypassed the kitchen. He stopped dead in front of the door leading to the greenhouse, Evelyn's private domain, where she spent hours every day tending to rare, imported exotic plants. The door was locked. Duke took a step back, his front paws furiously scratching at the tempered glass, his snout pointed up in a continuous whine. His amber eyes were locked onto the darkness inside. "Are you sure?" "Big guy?" Sarah muttered. She ran to the kitchen, grabbed a solid steel meat mallet from the drawer, and rushed back. Without a second thought, she smashed the heavy end of the mallet into the doorknob. The glass shattered. The lock snapped. Sarah pushed the door open. A wave of humid air, thick with the smell of potting soil, fertilizer, and the pungent aroma of exotic flora hit her in the face. The specialized purple fluorescent grow lights flickered on, casting ghostly shadows over dozens of potted plants. Duke didn't hesitate for a microsecond. He darted past the long metal tables stacked with moth orchids and ferns, making a beeline for the deepest corner of the greenhouse, where a small metal workbench stood, holding a few gardening tools and a wilted plant. He reared up on his hind legs, planted his front paws on the table, and shoved his nose into the crack of the only drawer, snorting violently. The sharp barks echoed off the glass walls. He began gnawing at the drawer handle, trying to rip it open. "Move over a sec, Duke." Sarah squeezed past the dog's massive frame. The drawer was secured with a small brass padlock. With one decisive strike of the mallet, Sarah shattered the shackle. She yanked the drawer open. There were no gardening tools inside. There was only a pair of thick black rubber gloves, a medical face mask, and a small red velvet box lying next to some spools of wire. Sarah's hands shook as she picked up the velvet box. She popped the lid. Resting inside was a tiny glass vial, the size of her pinky finger, bearing no label. It was about 2/3 full of a clear, slightly viscous liquid. Lying next to it was a micro syringe, the kind used by diabetics, with a dried crust of liquid still clinging to the needle tip. She held the vial up to eye level, muttering. "What are you?" Duke stretched his neck forward. The moment his nose caught the faint draft wafting from the open velvet box, the fur on his neck spiked. He took a step back, baring his teeth and growling at the tiny glass bottle, the exact same way he had growled at Evelyn at the hospital. It was the smell of death, the scent that had clung to Evelyn's clothes, that had seeped into the rug beside Arthur's bed on that fateful night, a scent that only the millions of olfactory receptors of a dog could isolate from among the thousands of other smells in this greenhouse. Sarah understood. A standard hospital tox screen only looked for common narcotics, sedatives, or heavy metals. But this liquid, this was a neurotoxin, a potent muscle paralytic, perhaps tetrodotoxin extracted from pufferfish or veterinary succinylcholine. Injected in microdoses, it would slow the respiratory and heart rate down to a point where standard machines couldn't register it, inducing clinical death. Unless a comprehensive toxicology spinal tap was performed, the very thing Evelyn used her spousal rights to block, no one would ever find it. Given just 24 more hours buried in the earth under a nailed-shut pine box, Arthur would have genuinely suffocated, a flawless, untraceable murder to inherit a massive fortune. "We found it! Duke!" Sarah gripped the glass vial tight, tears of absolute rage and disgust spilling over. "You are an amazing detective. Dad is going to be so proud of—" The sound of tires crushing gravel in the driveway suddenly rang out, cutting Sarah off. A blinding beam from a car's headlights swept across the wet glass panels of the greenhouse, casting shadows of branches against the walls like skeletal fingers clawing to get in. Sarah held her breath. Someone was home. She scrambled to shove the vial into her coat pocket. Duke stopped growling immediately. He dropped low to the ground, his ears perked up like radar dishes. The heavy thud of a car door closing echoed clearly through the rain. The rhythmic clicking of high heels marched up the stone steps toward the front door. It was Evelyn. She hadn't stayed at the hospital. Maybe her intuition flared when she realized Sarah and the dog had left. Maybe she wanted to dispose of the remaining poison before pulling her husband's life support tomorrow. "Damn it," Sarah cursed, backing up, staring into the pitch-black hallway, the rattle of a key turning in the lock. The front door creaked open. "Sarah?" Evelyn's voice drifted in, sweet but laced with ice, echoing through the dead silent house. "What are you doing home so late?" In the shadows of the greenhouse, Duke stepped in front of Sarah, shielding her. A deep tectonic rumble began to vibrate in his throat, bracing for an unavoidable war. The click of Evelyn's heels against the oak floor sounded deafening in the still of the night, step by step, closer and closer. Sarah held her breath, pressing herself into the shadows behind a rack of orchids in her coat pocket. The tiny glass vial felt as cold as a block of ice. She tightened her grip on the handle of the steel meat mallet, her palms slick with cold sweat, right beside her leg. Duke didn't make a sound. The 90-pound dog stood as still as a bronze statue, every muscle coiled tight, head lowered, his amber eyes locked onto the broken glass door. No barking, no growling. It was the absolute predatory state of a wild beast sensing a lethal threat. The hallway lights blazed to life. Evelyn appeared at the entrance of the greenhouse. She stopped dead when she saw the shattered lock and the broken glass glittering on the tiles. The mask of the grieving widow vanished entirely, replaced by a hardened, fiercely calculating face, her eyes narrowing in the glare. "Sarah," Evelyn spoke, dropping the sickly sweet act. Her voice was flat, chillingly calm. "I know you're in there. Come out. Your little amateur detective game is over." Sarah didn't answer. She took a half step back, the toe of her shoe lightly scraping the metal leg of a workbench. A sharp click sounded. Evelyn had reached into her expensive Hermes bag. She pulled out a small object that glinted under the purple fluorescent grow lights. Not a gun, not a knife. It was a large syringe, the barrel filled with a viscous yellow liquid. "You know," Evelyn whispered, stepping fully over the shattered glass, her heels crunching on the shards. "Arthur always bragged about how smart you were, just like him. But being too smart is a sin. Sarah, if you had just been a good girl and let him sleep peacefully in the dirt today, you would have inherited a third of the estate. Now, you've forced me to get my hands dirty. You won't get away with this, Evelyn." Sarah stepped out of the shadows, raising the mallet to chest level. Her voice shook, but it was fueled by pure fury. "I found the original vial. Dr. Iris is waiting for the police at the hospital. They'll know exactly what you pumped into my dad." Evelyn laughed, a short, sharp sound like a razor blade. "Concentrated succinylcholine, extracted and synthesized," she stated matter-of-factly, twirling the syringe in her fingers. "You found it? Good for you. But you don't understand medicine like I do." "Sarah, this compound metabolizes out of the bloodstream incredibly fast for the first 24 hours. It paralyzes the respiratory system without causing brain death. After that, it dissolves completely. No autopsy in the world can find it." She paused 5 paces away from Sarah, her eyes flashing with pure malice. "And guess what happens when a young, grief-stricken daughter tragically overdoses on her own father's insulin? A heartbreaking reunion in the afterlife." Before the words fully landed, Evelyn lunged with terrifying speed. She swung her arm, aiming to plunge the needle straight into Sarah's neck. Sarah stumbled backward, swinging the steel mallet up to block. The heavy mallet struck Evelyn's wrist. The syringe flew from her grasp, skittering across the floor and rolling beneath a potted fern. But Evelyn didn't stop. Driven by the desperate strength of a cornered rat, she lunged again, grabbing Sarah by the collar and throwing her backward. Sarah slammed hard against the metal work tables. "Give me the vial, you bitch!" Evelyn hissed, both hands locking around Sarah's throat, her red-painted fingernails digging into Sarah's flesh. Sarah thrashed, her hands clawing desperately at Evelyn's arms, but her chest began to burn from the lack of oxygen. Her vision blurred. The glass vial slipped from her coat pocket, rolling across the damp tile floor. Evelyn let go with one hand, reaching out to snatch the vial. That was when Duke struck. For the entire confrontation, the dog had been calculating the distance and the exact moment to move. Without a single warning bark, from out of the dark corner, 90 pounds of pure muscle launched into the air like a golden missile. A feral roar tore through Duke's chest. He slammed center mass into Evelyn with the kinetic force of a speeding motorcycle. Evelyn shrieked in terror as she was thrown entirely off Sarah. She crashed back into an orchid display rack, sending a dozen terracotta pots shattering onto the tiles. But Duke wasn't done, driven by his ultimate pack protection instinct. He followed through. He didn't go for the jugular to kill her like a wolf would. He mounted her, pinning Evelyn's shoulders to the mud and glass-covered floor with his heavy front paws, trapping her completely. His massive snout hovered mere inches from Evelyn's face. His sharp white canines were fully bared, saliva dripping from his jowls, splashing onto her ruined makeup. The hackles on his back stood straight up, and a vibrating, terrifying growl rumbled from deep within his throat, sounding like the engine of a machine designed to crush life. "Move, and I'll tear your throat out." The unspoken message was delivered so clearly that Evelyn went completely rigid with primal fear. Her eyes were bugged out, pupils dilated, her entire body trembling violently beneath the weight of the beast. She didn't dare breathe heavily. She didn't dare blink. For the first time in her life, the cold-blooded woman tasted absolute helplessness. Sarah coughed violently, gripping the edge of the table as she stumbled to her feet. She sucked in massive gulps of air, rubbing the bleeding scratches on her neck. She looked down. The tiny pinky-sized glass vial was lying perfectly intact in a puddle of water, and a few feet away, beneath the fern, lay the poisoned syringe. "Good boy. Duke, hold her right there," Sarah panted, tears spilling over her cheeks as a fierce smile broke across her face. With trembling hands, she reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and dialed, "911, what is your emergency?" Sarah stared dead into Evelyn's terrified eyes, trapped under the paws of a loyal dog. She gripped the glass vial tightly. "Send the police and a hazmat toxicology team to this address immediately." Sarah enunciated every single syllable, her voice ringing clear in the greenhouse. "I have the evidence to arrest a murderer, and my dad is still alive." Down on the floor, hearing the familiar, calming tone of Sarah's voice, Duke's tail gave one hard, solid thump against the tiles, but his blazing eyes didn't stray from his prey for a fraction of an inch. He would hold the line right here, until the red and blue sirens ripped through the night. The deafening wail of police sirens slicing through the rainy night had long faded into memory, replaced by the steady, peaceful of the monitors. 3 days later, the intensive care unit was bathed in the pale sunlight of an autumn morning on the small bedside table. The local newspaper lay neatly folded, screaming the front page headline, "Young widow arrested for rare neurotoxin murder plot." The evidence from the syringe in the greenhouse, combined with the comprehensive blood work run from the vial Sarah secured, had slammed the jail cell door shut on Evelyn. The antitoxin had been administered just in time, thanks to a little bit of luck and a massive amount of loyalty. The brain damage sustained by the man on the bed amounted to absolute zero. Arthur's index finger twitched, his eyelids, heavy as lead, slowly fluttered open. It took his vision a few seconds to clear the milky fog. The stark white hospital lights made him wince. His throat was bone dry from being intubated for days, and his body felt stiff, as if he'd just awoken from a centuries-long slumber. But the first thing that truly anchored Arthur's soul back to reality wasn't the smell of antiseptic, nor the glare of the hospital lights. It was a rough, wet warmth nuzzling against the back of his hand. Arthur managed the strength to turn his head to the right at the edge of the mattress. Duke was standing on his hind legs, his torso resting on the white sheets. His black, wet nose was twitching frantically, burying itself deep into Arthur's frail palm like a child desperate for warmth. When Duke saw Arthur's eyes open and look at him, the massive dog's entire body hitched for half a second. His ears flattened against his cheeks. His amber eyes welled up with tears. And then, from deep within his chest, burst a choked, overwhelmed whine, a sound that was a pure mixture of the pent-up trauma of the last few days and absolute, unadulterated joy. Duke's golden tail began to beat wildly against the metal bed frame, creating the most vibrant, joyous rhythm in the world. He stretched his long tongue out and slathered Arthur's face with kisses, completely ignoring the tangle of IV lines in the way. "Damn it, big guy!" Arthur rasped in a gravelly whisper, the pale corners of his mouth lifting into a weak smile. Using the last ounces of his strength, he turned his hand over and threaded his trembling fingers into the thick, soft fur at the nape of Duke's neck. The moment his fingers brushed against the pads of the dog's paws, he frowned slightly, feeling the thick white gauze wrapped around his claws. "What did you do? Trying to chop wood," he whispered, tears pooling in his eyes as he pressed his forehead against Duke's broad crown. The dog buried his head deeper into the crook of Arthur's neck. letting out a long, contented sigh. He didn't need to answer. For the rest of his life, he would never have to warn his master ever again, on the other side of the bed. Sarah leaned against the wall, both hands clamped over her mouth to muffle her choked sobs. Her shoulders shook violently, but her eyes were smiling radiantly. She stepped forward, throwing her arms around her father's shoulders, burying her face in his chest. The family of three was finally reunited. The human world is full of elaborate lies, dark conspiracies hidden behind the most perfect masks of love. Money could buy an expensive green burial, it could buy the fake tears of a young widow, and it could even fool the most advanced medical machinery. But, as they always say, there is one thing in this world that never knows how to lie: the love of a dog.